Right now, you're watching this video on your phone, but think for a moment. If this betrayal happened to you, what would you do? Comment below and subscribe. I had always imagined family gatherings to be warm, comforting events, a place where love was celebrated, where laughter filled every corner of the house, and where memories were made that would last a lifetime. I had spent the last 20 years of my life believing that my devotion, sacrifices, and unwavering loyalty to my family would grant me a place of honor, not just at the head of the table, but in their hearts. Yet that morning in Los Angeles, as I stepped into the grand hall of my aunt's anniversary celebration, I realized just how wrong I had been. The sun filtered through the towering windows, glinting off the crystal chandeliers, illuminating the pale cream walls and the meticulous flower arrangements. I had spent hours preparing my appearance, selecting a soft lavender silk dress that complemented the rose petals entwined in my hair. I had carefully chosen gifts for each family member, hoping they would convey my love and appreciation. I thought I was walking into an evening of joy, of laughter and familiar embraces, of being part of something that I had helped nurture all my life. But the moment I crossed the threshold, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. Something was off. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces of cousins, aunts, uncles, and distant relatives. There was a quiet buzz of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of fabric as people moved about. Yet, as I approached the grand table where the honored guests were seated, my heart sank. My name was not on the seating chart, not a card, not a handwritten note, nothing. For a brief second, I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was a mere oversight. Surely someone had misplaced a name card. Surely it was nothing personal. But the laughter died quickly as I overheard a conversation that pierced me sharper than any knife. "Don't let Margaret sit here," I heard my cousin whisper to another relative, a faint smirk on her face. "She doesn't deserve to be part of this." I froze. The words echoed through the ornate hall, bouncing off the marble floors and the gilded walls. My hands, clutching my carefully wrapped gifts, began to tremble. Faces that I'd once trusted now regarded me with a mixture of amusement and cruel satisfaction. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I had been deliberately excluded, not by mistake, but by design. The humiliation was calculated. My chest tightened as anger and disbelief mingled, forming a bitter taste in my mouth. I had spent decades of my life caring for this family. I had stayed up through countless sleepless nights, helping my siblings with their children. I had lent money when no one else would. I had been a shoulder to cry on for aging relatives, and yet here I stood, treated as if I were invisible. My mind raced back over the years to all the birthdays I had skipped, all the Christmas mornings I had spent alone preparing gifts and meals for others, while receiving little more than perfunctory thanks. Every act of devotion, every moment of unseen sacrifice suddenly felt meaningless in the face of this public erasure. My husband, Thomas, appeared at the head of the table, smiling politely, raising a glass as if nothing were wrong. I felt my stomach twist. How could he stand there, knowing full well what was happening, knowing the deliberate cruelty that had been plotted behind my back? My mind reeled with disbelief. He had orchestrated this. Every exclusion, every whisper, every glance that had been meant to wound me. The man I had trusted, the man I had shared 20 years of my life with, had chosen humiliation over loyalty, betrayal over love. I stepped aside, letting a maid pass, my mind spinning. My emotions were a storm, a swirl of sorrow, anger, and shock. But amid the chaos, a strange clarity began to emerge. This betrayal, as painful as it was, had revealed something crucial. I would not allow them to define the ending of my story. I would not crumble in silence. I would walk out with dignity and make them realize the gravity of what they had done. As I drifted toward the edge of the room, I allowed myself a few moments to grieve, not just for the humiliation, but for the loss of the family I had once believed in. Images flashed across my mind: late nights helping nieces and nephews with school projects, the countless times I had prepared holiday dinners for relatives while my own needs were ignored, the quiet moments when I had bailed out family members from financial troubles without complaint. I realized that every act of kindness I had offered had not been acknowledged, and now they were weaponizing my absence as a form of entertainment, a lesson in ridicule. I remembered the first time I had truly questioned my place in this family, a subtle moment that now seemed like a prelude to this ultimate betrayal. Years ago, at my father's birthday, a casual remark about my dedication had been twisted into mockery behind my back. At the time, I had dismissed it, telling myself that families quarrel, that misunderstandings happen. But looking around the hall now, I understood that the seeds of contempt had been sown long ago, nurtured by my so-called loved ones until they had bloomed into this public act of humiliation. I could feel my resolve hardening with each passing second. I would not run away in shame. I would not allow them to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. My dress, soft against my skin, seemed to empower me as I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin. Each step toward the exit was deliberate, measured, and full of purpose. I would leave, but not quietly. I would ensure that my absence was felt, that my dignity remained intact, and that the karmic consequences of their cruelty would follow them. As I approached the door, I caught sight of Thomas again. He looked at me with a fleeting expression of concern, or was it surprise? His carefully maintained mask of control faltered for a moment, and I knew that my walkout would be a jolt he had not anticipated. I could feel the eyes of the room tracking my every move, a mixture of curiosity, guilt, and perhaps the tiniest hint of regret flickering across a few faces. I did not look back. I did not allow myself to be tempted by any shred of remorse or apology from them. Their reaction, I decided, would be my victory, but on my own terms. Outside, the warm California air hit me like a cleansing wave. I drew a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders release as I realized that I was free from their judgment, their manipulation, and their cruelty. The gifts I had carried no longer mattered, nor did the arrangements I had so carefully planned. What mattered now was me, my dignity, my self-respect, and the quiet triumph of knowing that I had not let their betrayal define me. In that moment, I allowed myself a fleeting smile. This was not the end, it was a beginning. The family that sought to humiliate me had underestimated my strength, my resilience, and my understanding of justice. I would return, yes, but on my terms, and when I did, they would witness the consequences of their cruelty. I would write the ending they deserved, and it would be far more satisfying than any immediate retaliation could provide. Patience, I reminded myself, was my ally. As I walked down the driveway, leaving the grand hall behind me, I could feel the warm California air warming my face, a symbol of the life I still had, of the years ahead that were mine to shape. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also awakened something powerful within me. No longer would I allow myself to be a silent participant in my own humiliation. No longer would I grant them the comfort of my suffering. I was Margaret Emily Parker, and this story, their story, my story, would unfold exactly as I chose. The hum of Los Angeles life surrounded me, the distant traffic, the laughter of children in the park nearby, the faint melody of a street musician playing an old piano tune. For a moment, I felt untouchable, a quiet force of nature, and I knew that when I returned, nothing would ever be the same. They had underestimated me, but they would not do so again. Every whispered insult, every cruel glance, every carefully orchestrated humiliation had planted their own reckoning, and I, finally aware of my power, was ready to let it bloom. The morning after the anniversary gathering, I woke with a heaviness I had never known before. The betrayal still clung to me like a shadow, seeping into every corner of my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't think clearly, and yet I knew that wallowing in pain would achieve nothing. I had to understand exactly what had happened, who had been complicit, and why the people I had trusted most had conspired to erase me from a moment I had thought would celebrate family. As I sat at my kitchen table in my small Los Angeles apartment, sunlight streaming through the blinds, I sipped my coffee slowly, trying to summon some clarity. My mind kept replaying the cruel whispers, the calculated glances, the seating chart where my name had been deliberately omitted. How long had they been planning this? How long had my own husband, Thomas, been weaving this web of humiliation? Each thought cut deeper than the last. I felt a surge of anger that mingled with sorrow, a storm I had to contain if I wanted to approach this with any kind of strategy. I picked up my phone and began making a mental list of everyone who had been at the gathering. I noted those whose faces had held amusement, those whose eyes had flickered with guilt, and those who had been orchestrating the whispers. It was chilling to see how many people had taken part, knowingly or unknowingly, in what I had first believed was an isolated act. My stomach turned as I realized the depth of their conspiracy. This was not just a momentary lapse of courtesy. This was premeditated, a betrayal designed to humiliate me publicly. I thought back to Thomas, standing at the head of the table, the picture of composure while I had been sidelined. How had I not seen the signs earlier? The late nights on his phone, the subtle secrecy, the way he had dismissed my questions with practiced charm. I had been so focused on my own love for him, on my loyalty and devotion, that I had blinded myself to the cracks forming beneath the surface. Now, staring at my coffee cup, I realized that the man I had trusted most had been capable of profound cruelty, and that realization shook me more than the humiliation itself. For hours I tried to map out the timeline of their betrayal. Every interaction, every gathering over the past year suddenly appeared in a new sinister light. A careless comment here, a glance there, a seemingly innocent joke, all carefully designed to condition me to accept marginalization. And I had, unknowingly, played into their hands. The realization was bitter, but it was also liberating. Knowledge was power, and I intended to wield it carefully. I decided to reach out to my closest allies, those I knew could provide insight without judgment. My sister Helena had always been cautious, fiercely loyal, and I trusted that she would offer clarity. I called her, and after the initial pleasantries, I laid bare the events of the previous night. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. "Maggie, I can't believe he would do this to you," she said, her voice thick with anger. "You have given everything to this family, and they have treated you like a shadow. We need to plan, not just react." Her words were a balm, a reminder that I was not entirely alone. Together we began to dissect the dynamics at play, the subtle manipulations and overt betrayals that had culminated in my public erasure. Helena reminded me that patience and strategy were key. Reacting impulsively could give them the satisfaction of seeing me unsteady. I had to plan my next move with precision, ensuring that I retained my dignity while addressing the injustice. The next few days were a whirlwind of research and quiet reflection. I revisited old family gatherings in my mind, scrutinized interactions that had previously seemed trivial, and began to recognize patterns of exclusion and manipulation. I kept a detailed journal, noting down dates, events, and comments that now seemed to form a coherent narrative of intent. It was painstaking work, and at times emotionally draining, but it grounded me. By cataloging the betrayal, I reclaimed a measure of control over a situation that had initially rendered me powerless. One afternoon, I decided to confront Thomas, not in anger, but in calm, measured terms. I invited him to my apartment under the guise of a casual lunch, determined to observe his reactions and extract the truth. When he arrived, smiling politely as always, I could see the faint flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had assumed that I would retreat quietly, that I would internalize my humiliation and allow life to proceed as before. But I had other plans. As we sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken tension, I watched him carefully. I spoke deliberately, recounting the events of the previous night without accusation, letting the facts speak for themselves. His face remained composed, but the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed him. I pressed further, asking questions about specific interactions, about decisions made, about whispered comments and omissions. With each question, his composure frayed, and I saw the man I had loved and trusted falter under the weight of his own deceit. Thomas attempted to rationalize, to minimize, to deflect responsibility, but I did not allow him the comfort of his usual charm. I remained calm, steady, and unwavering, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. By the end of the conversation, I had achieved what I had intended, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. He could no longer pretend innocence or ignorance. He had been forced to face the truth, and that truth was mine to hold. Following this confrontation, I felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness that had been absent since the moment of betrayal. I realized that the path forward required more than just acknowledgement. It required action. I began to formulate a plan that would ensure not just my own dignity, but also a form of justice that was subtle, calculated, and ultimately satisfying. This was not about revenge in its rawest form. It was about reclaiming my narrative and ensuring that those who had sought to diminish me would recognize the cost of their cruelty. I also reconnected with friends outside the family circle, individuals who had always valued my integrity and resilience. Their support reinforced my resolve, reminding me that my worth was not contingent on the approval of those who had betrayed me. Through long walks in the park, quiet dinners, and reflective conversations, I began to rebuild my sense of self, understanding that while the betrayal was wounding me, it had also illuminated a strength I had not fully appreciated. Days turned into a week, and I began to notice subtle shifts in my own perception. The anger, while still present, had transformed into clarity. The humiliation, while indelible, had become a source of motivation. I realized that the family's attempt to control my narrative had failed. I had taken the reins, and now the story was mine to tell. I began drafting letters, carefully choosing words that conveyed the depth of my hurt without descending into bitterness. These letters were not necessarily intended to be sent immediately, but they served as a blueprint for the confrontation and acknowledgement that would eventually unfold. Through this process, I also reflected on my own life choices, my relationships, and the patterns I had allowed to persist for decades. I recognized that while the family's betrayal was egregious, I had, at times, allowed my devotion to obscure my own boundaries and needs. This insight was painful, but essential. It taught me that dignity is maintained not just through actions towards others, but through the standards we set for ourselves. By the end of the week, I had forged a new sense of purpose. The anniversary gathering, intended as a moment of public humiliation, had instead become the catalyst for transformation. I would not simply endure, I would act strategically, thoughtfully, and with a steadfast commitment to preserving my dignity. The family had underestimated me, as had Thomas, and I intended to ensure that they would not do so again. Every interaction, every conversation, every decision moving forward would be guided by a clear understanding of who I was, what I valued, and the consequences that awaited those who had betrayed me. I spent that evening on the balcony of my apartment, the Los Angeles skyline stretching before me, the lights twinkling like distant stars. I felt a calm determination settle over me. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential conflict and discomfort, but it was mine to navigate. I was no longer the passive participant in my own story. I was the author, and the narrative would unfold exactly as I chose. In the weeks that followed, I began implementing subtle changes. The days following my confrontation with Thomas were some of the most surreal I had ever experienced. The shock of betrayal had begun to fade, replaced by a steely determination I had not known I possessed. Yet, the sting lingered in the quiet moments, a whisper reminding me of the humiliation I had endured. I realized that moving forward required not just understanding, but action, a way to assert my dignity without descending into mindless retaliation. I decided to revisit the gathering in my mind, dissecting every interaction, every smile, every carefully timed comment. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but necessary. Each detail was a clue, a piece of the puzzle revealing the scale of the deception. I was struck by the orchestration of it all, the subtle exclusion, the whispered jokes, the deliberate omissions from the seating arrangement. They had treated me as if I were invisible, and yet the plan had been so meticulously crafted that it could have gone unnoticed had I not been so attuned to the undercurrents of our family dynamics. I began reaching out to a few extended family members discreetly, testing the waters, gauging loyalty, and seeking insight. Not everyone responded as I had hoped. Some offered vague condolences but made no effort to understand my perspective. Others, quietly supportive, shared stories of past manipulations and exclusions, confirming what I had begun to suspect. This betrayal was part of a larger pattern, one that had been normalized over decades. Their support, though subtle, provided me with the reassurance that I was not entirely alone, and that the narrative I had once believed, a loving, caring family, was more complicated and fragile than I had imagined. One evening, as I sat in my living room surrounded by notes, letters, and journals documenting every relevant memory and interaction, I realized that I had reached a critical juncture. The path I chose next would define not only my relationship with this family, but also my sense of self. I could respond impulsively, unleashing anger and confrontation, or I could proceed strategically, allowing time and observation to strengthen my position. The choice was clear: dignity over impulsivity, patience over rashness, intelligence over emotion. The following weekend, I received an invitation to a smaller family gathering, a casual brunch at my sister Helena's home. The invitation seemed innocent enough, and I accepted, though I remained cautious. I needed to observe, to gather more information, to understand the subtle dynamics that had allowed the previous betrayal to occur. As I arrived at her home, I noticed the careful choreography of interactions. Certain relatives avoided eye contact, others lingered with polite smiles, but the energy was tense, loaded with unspoken words. Helena greeted me warmly, her presence a comforting reminder of loyalty and support. "I know things have been rough," she whispered as we settled in the kitchen with coffee, "but you're handling this beautifully. Don't let them shake you. You're stronger than they realize." Her words were a balm, reaffirming my resolve. The brunch proceeded, conversations flowing, laughter punctuating the air, but my attention remained keen, analyzing, observing. Every glance, every casual remark, Every nuance held potential insight into the family's current dynamics and allegiances. During the meal, a distant cousin inadvertently revealed more than intended. A careless remark, meant as a joke, hinted at ongoing discussions about my placement at future events, confirming that the humiliation I had experienced at the anniversary gathering was not an isolated incident, but rather a calculated effort to marginalize me. My stomach churned, but I maintained composure, letting the words wash over me while my mind cataloged the revelation. This was another layer of understanding, another piece of the intricate puzzle of deceit. As the brunch wound down, I took Helena aside and shared my observations, detailing the subtle manipulations and the casual complicity I had witnessed. Her face darkened as I spoke, a mixture of anger and sorrow evident in her expression. "I can't believe they would do this," she said. "After everything you've done for this family, it's disgraceful." We discussed options, weighing confrontation versus strategic withdrawal, and ultimately agreed that patience and careful planning would yield the most satisfying resolution. The humiliation had been public, but the reckoning could be private and deliberate. Returning home that afternoon, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I began outlining a plan, one that would allow me to reclaim my narrative while maintaining dignity and control. It would involve measured exposure of the family's duplicity, carefully timed communications, and strategic decisions about attendance at future events. My goal was not vengeance in its rawest form, but rather a form of justice that would highlight the consequences of their cruelty. Over the next few days, I drafted letters and messages articulating my feelings with precision. Every word was chosen to convey the depth of my hurt while maintaining composure, ensuring that the communication reflected strength rather than bitterness. I reflected on past instances of subtle manipulation, documenting them as evidence of a pattern of behavior. This process, though emotionally taxing, was empowering. By translating pain into clarity and strategy, I reclaimed agency over my life and my interactions with this family. Late one evening, as I reviewed my notes, I realized the importance of self-preservation and boundaries. The betrayal had highlighted areas of my life where I had allowed loyalty to overshadow my self-respect. It was a painful but necessary revelation. I resolved to maintain firm boundaries, to protect my emotional well-being, and to engage with family members only on terms that respected my dignity and autonomy. This shift in perspective was liberating, providing me with a sense of control that had been absent during the anniversary gathering. As the week progressed, I also began reconnecting with friends outside the family sphere, those who had always valued me for who I was rather than the role I played in a family hierarchy. Their support was grounding, reminding me that my worth was not defined by the approval of those who had betrayed me. Through quiet dinners, long walks, and reflective conversations, I began to rebuild confidence, understanding that the betrayal, while painful, had also revealed strengths I had previously underestimated. One particularly quiet evening, I sat on my balcony gazing at the Los Angeles skyline. The lights of the city shimmered like distant stars, and I felt a calm determination settle over me. The betrayal had been a catalyst, awakening a strength and resolve I had not known existed. I realized that while the humiliation inflicted by my family was temporary, the dignity and self-respect I cultivate for myself, the strength I had reclaimed, would endure far beyond their fleeting satisfaction. In the days that followed, I began implementing subtle changes to my interactions with the family. I limited contact with those who had been complicit in the betrayal, prioritized relationships with supportive relatives, and carefully monitored the dynamics at future events. Each decision, no matter how small, reinforced my autonomy and served as a reminder that I was no longer a passive participant in my own story. I also focused on personal growth and self-care, understanding that emotional resilience required attention to both mind and body. Daily routines of reflection, journaling, and quiet contemplation became essential. I recognized that the betrayal, though devastating, had provided an opportunity to strengthen my inner foundation, to cultivate a sense of self that was independent of external validation. By the end of the week, I felt a renewed sense of clarity and empowerment. The anniversary gathering, once a source of public humiliation, had become a turning point in my life. I had transformed from a woman blindsided by betrayal into someone fully aware of her strengths, limitations, and the power she held over her own narrative. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I now walked it with confidence, dignity, and a strategic vision that would ensure the family understood the weight of their actions. Through this process, I also began to reflect on the nature of forgiveness and accountability. I realized that forgiving someone does not necessitate condoning their actions. It means acknowledging the hurt, understanding the context, and choosing to move forward without allowing the betrayal to define you. Accountability, on the other hand, requires careful planning and strategic action. I had learned that both elements were crucial in navigating complex family dynamics and maintaining personal integrity. In the quiet moments of reflection, I felt a deep sense of resolve. The betrayal, while painful, had illuminated the resilience, intelligence, and strength that define me. I understood that humiliation inflicted by others is temporary, but the dignity and self-respect we cultivate indefinitely endure. With that understanding, I embraced the next phase of my life with unwavering confidence, prepared to face the challenges and revelations that awaited me with grace, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of self. Weeks had passed since the anniversary gathering, and yet the sting of betrayal lingered, sharper in some moments than in others. I had learned to navigate my days with a quiet resilience, balancing reflection with decisive action. Each encounter with family members, each conversation, each lingering glance carried potential insight, and I had become adept at reading the subtle cues that revealed both loyalty and duplicity. The calm determination I had cultivated was a shield, protecting me from impulsive reactions that might have compromised my dignity. The next major family event approached, a summer garden gathering intended to celebrate my uncle's retirement. Unlike the anniversary, this one was smaller, more intimate, yet no less critical in terms of understanding the undercurrents within the family. Accepting the invitation was a calculated decision. I needed to observe, to collect information, and to assert my presence in a way that reaffirmed my dignity. I arrived early, allowing myself time to absorb the environment, noting seating arrangements, decorations, and the subtle hierarchies that dictated interaction. As I stepped into the garden, the scent of blooming flowers mingled with the faint aroma of grilled meats and fresh pastries. The family members were scattered in small groups, their faces a mixture of anticipation and mild apprehension. I noticed immediately the subtle avoidance practiced by some, the guarded politeness of others, and the genuine warmth from a few key individuals. These observations were crucial. They would inform my strategy for engagement, ensuring that I retained control over my narrative and presence throughout the event. Thomas arrived shortly after me, his expression composed yet tinged with a subtle unease. I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flitted toward me occasionally before quickly redirecting. It was clear that he understood the dynamic had shifted. He could no longer rely on secrecy and orchestrated humiliation. I, on the other hand, was fully aware of my power in this moment. I had claimed it, nurtured it, and refined it into a quiet but undeniable force. Throughout the gathering, I engaged in measured conversations, carefully balancing warmth with assertiveness. I complimented relatives sincerely, offered thoughtful observations about the garden and arrangements, and navigated discussions with subtle precision. Each interaction was a test, an opportunity to gauge loyalty, ascertain truth, and subtly remind those around me that I was neither naive nor easily manipulated. My confidence, grounded in clarity and strategy, began to ripple outward, reshaping the dynamics of the gathering in subtle but powerful ways. During a quiet moment, I observed a small group of relatives whispering near the hedge. I could hear fragments of their conversation, enough to discern the lingering resentment and gossip that had fueled the anniversary betrayal. Their tone was defensive, tinged with guilt, yet also tinged with curiosity. They had underestimated me, assumed I would remain passive, and now, witnessing my composed presence, they were beginning to recalibrate their perception. This subtle shift was satisfying, though I did not allow myself the indulgence of overt triumphs. Patience and timing would be key in ensuring a more profound resolution later. After a brief break, I found a quiet spot under a magnolia tree to reflect. The breeze carried the faint hum of distant laughter, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the warmth of the California sun. In that moment, I allowed myself to process the emotional weight I had been carrying for weeks. The betrayal, while devastating, had also revealed a depth of resilience I had not fully recognized. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, reevaluate relationships, and cultivate a sense of self that was independent of approval from others. This clarity was empowering, fortifying me for the interactions and decisions that lay ahead. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed subtle gestures of acknowledgement from certain family members, a fleeting glance of regret, a hesitant smile, a momentary pause in conversation, all small but meaningful indicators that the dynamics had begun to shift. I also observed Thomas carefully navigating the gathering, clearly aware that his previous strategies of manipulation were no longer effective. This realization reinforced my confidence, confirming that I was no longer a passive participant, but an active architect of my own narrative. During the evening, the garden was bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun, the air fragrant with flowers and the faint scent of evening dew. I took a moment to walk among the guests, engaging in brief but purposeful conversations, each interaction reinforcing my composure and presence. I could feel the subtle recalibration occurring around me. The whispers that once carried amusement or judgment now contained uncertainty, curiosity, and in some cases, quiet admiration for the poise I maintained despite past humiliations. At one point, Thomas approached, his expression cautious. "Margaret," he began, his voice measured, I wanted to talk about everything." I nodded slowly, my gaze steady, inviting him to continue without allowing the upper hand to slip. He attempted to rationalize, to offer explanations, to frame his actions as misunderstandings or missteps. But I listened without interruption, weighing each word, recognizing the deflection and self-preservation embedded within his narrative. When he paused, I spoke, calmly but firmly, outlining the impact of his actions, the depth of betrayal I had felt, and the necessity of accountability. My voice was steady, unwavering, conveying strength rather than anger. The conversation, though difficult, was a turning point. Thomas could no longer hide behind charm or manipulation. He was forced to confront the consequences of his choices. I felt a sense of liberation in articulating the truth, in reclaiming control of the dialogue, and in asserting the dignity that had been denied to me. The encounter was not about reconciliation, but about establishing boundaries, understanding, and a measure of accountability that had been absent for too long. Following this interaction, I spent the remainder of the evening observing the subtle transformations occurring within the family. Some members remained aloof, their behavior unchanged, yet others displayed tentative signs of respect, curiosity, and recognition of my resilience. These small shifts, though incremental, were evidence of the effectiveness of measured, deliberate action. I realized that change need not be explosive to be impactful. Subtle recalibration often carried a deeper, more enduring effect. Returning home that night, I reflected on the growth I had experienced over the past weeks. The betrayal, while painful, had catalyzed a journey of self-discovery, resilience, and empowerment. I recognized that humiliation inflicted by others was temporary, but the dignity I cultivated and the strength I reclaimed would endure indefinitely. I was Margaret Emily Parker, and the narrative of my life was no longer subject to the manipulations or judgment of those who had once sought to diminish me. Chapter 5. Full Story. The anticipation of the next family event, the grand holiday celebration, was unlike anything I had experienced in months. I had spent weeks carefully observing, reflecting, and strategizing, transforming the initial humiliation and betrayal into a quiet strength that had begun to radiate outward. I knew that this gathering would be crucial, not only for my own closure, but for demonstrating, without aggression, the consequences of deliberate cruelty. Every interaction, every glance, every word had to reflect dignity, composure, and the power I had reclaimed. The evening was crisp, the California air carrying a hint of winter spice as I approached the festively decorated hall. The aroma of roasted meats, cinnamon, and pine greeted me as I stepped inside, the twinkle of holiday lights illuminating the faces of relatives both familiar and distant. The atmosphere buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the faint tension that accompanies carefully curated family events. But this time I entered with awareness, with strategy, and with an unshakable sense of self. Immediately, I noticed the subtle shifts in dynamics since the last gathering. Certain family members who had previously exuded indifference or smug amusement now regarded me with cautious curiosity. Their eyes sought me out briefly, quickly darting away, betraying a mixture of surprise and apprehension. I held their gaze with calm assurance, my posture straight, my presence deliberate. I had learned that power is often conveyed in quiet confidence, in unspoken acknowledgement of one's worth, and tonight I intended to embody that fully. Thomas arrived shortly after me, his expression a careful mask of neutrality, though I detected the faint tremor in his demeanor that indicated unease. He knew, as did I, that the narrative had shifted. The humiliation he had once orchestrated would no longer define me. I moved through the room with purpose, greeting relatives warmly, engaging in measured conversations, and allowing subtle gestures of recognition and respect to underscore my presence. Each interaction was a statement. I was neither naive nor easily marginalized, and the dignity that had been denied to me previously was now fully in my control. During a quiet moment, I observed a small cluster of relatives whispering near the dessert table. The conversation carried hints of regret, curiosity, and perhaps a dawning awareness of the consequences of their past actions. I allowed myself a brief smile, recognizing that the shifts I had cultivated over weeks of strategic observation and interaction were taking root. The seeds of accountability, though subtle, were beginning to grow. I did not rush this process. True power, I had learned, is often revealed through patience, subtlety, and unwavering composure. The event progressed, and I navigated the conversations with grace, balancing warmth with assertiveness. I offered compliments, engaged in thoughtful discussion, and acknowledged the contributions of others with sincerity. Every word, every gesture was deliberate, reinforcing my presence and subtly reminding those around me that I was no longer to be underestimated or dismissed. I noticed with quiet satisfaction that even Thomas seemed tentative in his interactions, as if aware that the balance of influence had shifted irrevocably. Later, as the evening wound down, the host called for a toast. I rose with the others, lifting my glass with calm composure. My gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of those who had once sought to humiliate me. In that moment, I felt an unspoken acknowledgement pass between us. The dynamics had changed. I did not speak of past betrayals aloud, did not seek vindication through confrontation, yet the presence of my dignity, strength, and composure conveyed more power than any words could have expressed. After the toast, a few relatives approached me quietly. Some offered genuine apologies, tentative at first but heartfelt in their recognition of past wrongs. Others expressed admiration for the poise and resilience I had demonstrated in the weeks following the anniversary betrayal. Each acknowledgement, each subtle gesture of respect was a testament to the power of patience, strategic action, and the unwavering maintenance of dignity. I responded with calm grace, accepting the acknowledgement without bitterness, reinforcing the quiet but undeniable authority I had cultivated. Thomas, for his part, remained at a distance for much of the evening. When he finally approached, his demeanor was subdued, his earlier confidence replaced by tentative recognition of the consequences of his past actions. I engaged with him with measured politeness, maintaining composure while allowing the weight of unspoken accountability to linger between us. It was not a moment of reconciliation, nor was it an expression of anger. It was a subtle but profound assertion of the boundaries, respect, and dignity that had been denied to me previously. As the celebration drew to a close, I took a quiet moment outside, the cool evening air brushing against my face. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the shock of public humiliation to the strategic reclamation of my dignity and narrative. The betrayal, once a source of profound pain, had become a catalyst for growth, reflection, and empowerment. I realized that the lessons learned extended far beyond family dynamics. They were about understanding the nature of human behavior, recognizing the importance of boundaries, and cultivating a strength that is resilient, enduring, and self-defined. In the weeks following the holiday gathering, the subtle shifts within the family continued to unfold. Certain members, previously dismissive or complicit, began to approach interactions with increased respect and awareness. The environment that had once fostered humiliation and exclusion gradually transformed, influenced not by confrontation or aggression, but by the consistent demonstration of dignity, clarity, and strategic composure. My presence, unwavering and deliberate, had reshaped perceptions and prompted reflection among those who had once sought to diminish me. I also focused on reinforcing my own sense of autonomy and personal growth. I nurtured relationships outside the family circle, engaged in activities that fulfilled me, and invested in self-care, reflection, and personal development. The betrayal, while painful, had provided clarity about my priorities, values, and the importance of surrounding myself with individuals who respected, supported, and valued my presence and contributions. This understanding fortified my resolve and enhanced my capacity for discernment in future interactions. Through this journey, I discovered that true power is not derived from domination, revenge, or confrontation, but from the steady cultivation of dignity, resilience, and strategic awareness. The humiliation I had endured was transient. The true measure of strength lies in the cultivation of self-respect, strategic awareness, and the ability to navigate adversity with composure and intelligence. I had experienced betrayal, humiliation, and exclusion, but I had transformed these challenges into catalysts for empowerment, clarity, and enduring dignity. As I stood once more on my balcony, watching the city lights shimmer across Los Angeles, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from betrayal to reclamation had been arduous, yet it had illuminated strengths, insights, and capacities that would endure throughout my life. I was Margaret Emily Parker, fully aware of my power, resilience, and ability to shape my own narrative. The family's attempt to diminish me had ultimately strengthened me, revealing that dignity, composure, and strategic action are far more powerful than any attempt at public humiliation. And in that quiet moment, I smiled, fully, truly, and without reservation. The story had been reclaimed. The betrayal had been acknowledged and balanced by the unwavering power of self-respect. The karmic payoff, subtle yet undeniable, had been realized. I was free from their judgment, their manipulation, and their cruelty. My narrative was my own, and I would continue to write it with clarity, strength, and unwavering dignity.